They had not prepared for the smell of baking bread. In the final desperate accounting of their folly, amid the scent of freezing pine sap, dying embers, and the metallic tang of fear, it was the impossible aroma of warm, yeasted bread that announced the totality of their failure. It was a scent that belonged to a different world, a world they had confidently declared dead and buried under a mountain of ice. But to understand how that scent became their judgment, you must first understand the silence that preceded it. The silence of a valley holding its breath, waiting for the first killing frost of a winter that had been given a name. They called it the Whispering Death. Old Jedediah, who had traps in these mountains before the settlement had a name, had read the signs in the frantic industry of the squirrels and the unusual thickness of the beaver pelts. The aspens had turned not to gold that autumn, but to a brittle, bloodless yellow, their leaves falling all at once in a single, sorrowful sigh. The wind that came down from the unforgiving peaks tasted of iron and distance. It was a cold that promised to stay, a cold that promised to take. The settlement of Croft's Crossing was a testament to stubbornness, carved into a narrow valley that was beautiful for 3 months of the year and brutal for the other 9. Its founder, and the man for whom it was named, was Silas Croft. He was a master builder, a man whose confidence was as solid and square-jawed as the log cabins he erected. His cabins were monuments of timber, each log hand-hewn, notched with a satisfying precision that left no room for doubt. They were good, honest structures, built to withstand the ordinary furies of the mountains. But this was not to be an ordinary winter, and Alara was not an ordinary woman. She was a widow at 22. Her husband, young Thomas, had been taken by a fever that spring, leaving her with little more than a half-finished cabin, a mountain of debt to Silas Croft for the building materials, and a quiet resilience that the townsfolk mistook for fragility. She was an outsider twice over, first by her marriage into the valley, and second by her blood. Her grandmother had been Danish, a woman from the old world who carried stories of ice-locked seas and houses burrowed into the earth like hibernating bears. These stories were Alara's only inheritance, and in Croft's Crossing, they were worth less than nothing. The conventional wisdom of the valley was simple and absolute. To survive the winter, you needed a Croft-built cabin, a roaring cast-iron stove, and a woodpile the size of a small chapel. The stove was the hungry god of the hearth, and cordwood was the only acceptable sacrifice. But a blight had crept through the valley's timber that summer, a creeping sickness that left the pines weeping amber tears and the oaks spotted with a powdery gray decay. The woodpile, the very foundation of their survival, was compromised. What they could harvest was green, sappy, and burned with a sullen, smoky reluctance. Alara's own woodpile was a pathetic mound, barely enough to last through November. The debt on her unfinished cabin was a lead weight in the pit of her stomach. She knew, with the chilling certainty of the dispossessed, that her survival was a matter of public debate. The debate concluded on a cold, gray morning in late October. Silas Croft arrived at her cabin, his face set in the grim mask of a man performing a necessary, if unpleasant, duty. He was not alone. He had brought with him Mr. Albright, the land agent, a man whose face seemed perpetually pinched from smelling something foul, and 2 other town elders. They did not ask to come inside. They stood in the yard, their boots planted firmly on the land she was about to lose. "Ilara," Silas began, his voice devoid of warmth, "we've reviewed the ledgers, and we've reviewed your situation." He gestured vaguely at the small woodpile, the gesture a condemnation in itself. Thomas, may he rest, left his accounts in arrears. And this cabin? It requires a man's hands to finish. More importantly, it requires a man's labor to feed. He meant the stove. "I can work," Ilara said, her voice quiet but steady. I can finish the chinking. I can chop my own wood. Silas Croft almost smiled. It was a sad, tired expression, the look of a man explaining the world to a child. My dear girl, you have a cord and a half of green pine. That won't get you through the first heavy snow. The stove in this cabin can consume that much in 3 weeks of true cold. It's a matter of physics. He said the word physics as if it were a legal statute, an immutable law she was foolishly trying to contest. We cannot, in good conscience, watch you attempt this. It would be a suicide. Mr. Albright cleared his throat. The land charter is clear. In the event of the primary leaseholder's demise, the deed reverts to the company if the property is deemed untenable, unmanaged. Given the debt and your limited prospects for surviving the coming season, we are exercising our right to reclaim the property. It was a death sentence delivered with the bland apathy of a business transaction. They were not just taking her home, they were taking her chance. They were casting her out, not into the wilderness, but into a state of absolute impossibility. She could leave the valley, of course. A 3-week journey on foot over the pass before the snows made it impassable. She had no money, no kin to go to. Leaving was the same as staying. It was just a different way to die. Where am I to go? She asked. The question hung in the cold air, thin and fragile. Silas Croft finally looked at her, a flicker of something like pity in his eyes. There is a room at the boarding house in town. The church has agreed to cover your board, until the thaw. He did not say what would happen then. He did not have to. She would be a charity case, a burden, a ghost haunting the edges of their lives. This is woman's folly, one of the elders muttered, not unkindly. A place like this needs a husband. Alara looked past them, at the great, gray wall of the mountain that formed the valley's western edge. She looked at the dark slash of the waterfall, a place the children called the Weeping Maid. She looked at the trees, the sky, the cold, hard ground. She felt not anger, not despair, but a strange, cold clarity. A resolve settling in her bones, as dense and heavy as river stone. She would not go to the boarding house. She would not be a ghost. I will see this through, she said, the words barely a whisper. They did not hear her. Or if they did, they chose not to understand. They saw only a young woman, defeated, standing on the threshold of a home that was no longer hers. They saw a problem that they had, in their minds, solved with cold, practical charity. They tipped their hats, turned their backs, and walked away, their boots crunching on the frost-hardened dirt. They left her alone with the silence and the coming cold. That night, in the shell of her former home, with the wind finding its way through the unchinked logs, Alara did not weep. She unpacked the small, scarred leather trunk that held the sum of her personal history. Beneath her mother's wedding dress, in a small collection of pressed flowers, she found it. Her grandmother's journal. It was bound in faded blue cloth, the pages filled with a spidery, elegant script. It was written in Danish, a language Alara had learned at her grandmother's knee. For years, the book had been a collection of quaint stories and strange recipes. Tonight, she read it with new eyes. She read it not as a curious descendant, but as a desperate engineer searching for a blueprint. Her grandmother, Astrid, had grown up on the wind-swept coast of Jutland, a place where the trees grew sideways and the sea was a constant, hungry presence. Survival there was not about fighting the elements with brute force, but about yielding to them, about finding shelter in their pockets of mercy. She wrote not of grand log fortresses, but of the Jordhul, the earth house. Alara read late into the night, the candle flame guttering in the drafts. Astrid's words were not poetry, they were instruction. She wrote of the earth's deep, abiding warmth, the concept of thermal mass. The stone does not make heat, she wrote. It holds it. It remembers the sun long after the sky has forgotten. A great fire is a fool's comfort, for it eats your winter's work in a single night. A small fire in a house of stone is a wise friend who stays until morning. Then, Alara found the chapter that made her stop breathing. It was titled Klippehjemme bag Vanfalde, the cliff home behind the waterfall. It was a strange, almost mythical idea. Astrid described a visit to Norway, to a remote fjord where a family had built their home in a deep rock alcove directly behind a cascade of water. It seemed impossible, a recipe for damp and misery. But her grandmother's methodical mind had dissected the physics of it, sketching diagrams in the margins. The waterfall, she explained, was not the enemy. It was a curtain, a dynamic, living wall that created a unique microclimate. The water, emerging from deep within the earth, was a constant temperature, warmer than the winter air and cooler than the summer sun. It acted as a massive thermal regulator. The spray would freeze in the deep winter, forming an outer wall of ice, a natural insulator, a kind of crystalline igloo. The greatest challenge, she noted, was not warmth, but air, breathability, dampness. And for that, she had a solution so ingenious, so counterintuitive, that Alara had to read the passage 3 times to fully grasp it. It was a complex flue system, a Roig-canal, built not of stone, but of fired clay pipes. It was designed to run up the back of the rock face, using the natural temperature differential between the warm cave air and the freezing outside air to create a powerful, self-sustaining draft. This draft would pull the smoke and moisture out, while a separate, baffled intake pipe near the floor would draw in fresh, dry air, pre-warming it as it passed through a channel in the warm earth. It was a living, breathing house, a lung built into the mountain. She began that very day. She took nothing from the cabin but a spade, an axe, her husband's pick, a cast-iron pot, and the clothes on her back. She left the key on the table, a final, silent act of severance. She walked not towards the town, but away from it, towards the Weeping Maid waterfall. The place was a deep, concave scar in the granite cliff face, perhaps 50 feet high and 30 feet across. The waterfall itself was not a thundering torrent, but a steady, shimmering veil of water that fell from a fissure high above, splashing into a shallow pool below. The alcove behind it was deep, perhaps 20 feet from the water curtain to the back wall. It was not a true cave, but an immense, open-fronted shelter, littered with fallen rock and damp earth. The air was cool and smelled of wet stone and moss. This would be her home. The first task was to shape the space. The floor of the alcove was uneven, a jumble of rock and soil. For a week, she worked with the pick and spade, her body screaming in protest. She levered out boulders, using smaller rocks as fulcrums. She scraped and dug, leveling a space about 12 feet wide and 15 feet deep. The blisters on her hands broke, bled, and hardened into calluses. She was not just digging a floor. She was carving out her right to exist. Every swing of the pick was a rebuttal to Silas Croft's pity. Every shovelful of earth was a rejection of his judgment. Next came the most critical and difficult part of her grandmother's design, the flue. She needed clay. She remembered a spot downriver where the bank was a thick, promising gray. For 2 days, she hauled buckets of the heavy, wet clay up the slope to her nascent home. She mixed it with water and sand, stomping it with her bare feet until it was a smooth, pliable consistency. This was not woman's work, they would have said, but it was the work of survival, and survival was genderless. Following Astrid's diagrams, she began to form the flue pipes. Each section was about 2 feet long and 6 inches in diameter. She shaped them around a smooth log, carefully sealing the seams. It was slow, painstaking work. She then built a small, temporary kiln against the cliff face, using flat stones and more clay. She fed it with dry deadfall she gathered from the forest floor, slowly raising the temperature over a day and a night, listening for the telltale cracking that would mean failure. She slept in fits, curled up near the kiln's warmth, her dreams filled with the smell of baking earth. When the kiln cooled, she pulled the pipes out. They were not perfect. 2 had cracked, but 5 were whole, fired to a hard, terracotta resilience. They were the bones of her house's lung. Now came the installation, the most dangerous part of the work. The flue needed to be fixed to the back wall of the alcove, rising 15 feet to a small fissure in the rock that she hoped would draw the smoke out and away. She built a rickety scaffold of saplings, lashed together with roots and vines. With a rope slung over her shoulder, she hauled each precious clay pipe up the scaffold, her muscles burning with the effort. She used a mortar of clay and fine gravel to secure the pipes to the rock, one on top of the other, creating a vertical chimney that hugged the stone. It was during this phase that she had her first visitors. Silas Croft and 2 other men, on their way to hunt the higher elevations, saw the smoke from her kiln and came to investigate. They found her perched on the scaffold, covered head to toe in mud, wrestling a clay pipe into place. They stared in disbelief. The scene was absurd, pathetic. A lone woman building a mud house behind a waterfall. "Good Lord, child," one of the men said, unable to hide his astonishment. "What in God's name are you doing?" "I am building my home," Alara said, not looking down. Silas Croft stepped forward, his eyes taking in the leveled earth, the piles of clay, the crude kiln. He saw not ingenuity, but desperation. He saw madness. "This is folly," he said, his voice flat. He pointed a thick finger at her work. "This is a den, a grave. The damp will kill you before the cold even gets a chance. The first hard freeze, and that waterfall will seal you in here like a tomb." "The ice will be my wall," she replied, her voice echoing slightly in the alcove. He snorted, a sharp, dismissive sound. "A wall of ice? And you'll breathe what? Frozen water? Child, listen to me. Give up this madness. Come back to town. There is no shame in accepting help." "There is shame in being told I cannot survive," she said. She slotted the final pipe into place. The flue was complete. Silas shook his head, a deep, weary sadness in his expression. He looked at the other men. They exchanged glances that spoke volumes. The poor widow had lost her mind. Grief had unhinged her. "We'll call it Croft's Cascade Folly," one of the men said with a chuckle as they turned to leave. The name stuck. It became a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered over dinner tables. The story of the mad widow who chose to live in a mud hole behind the weeping maid. Think about this for a moment. Think of the weight of that certainty, the crushing consensus of experts who believe they are saving you from yourself. Every one of us has a Silas Croft in our lives, a voice of authority, of convention, of well-meaning condescension that tells us our plan is folly. The question is not whether you will hear that voice. The question is what you will do after it has spoken. Ilara did not hear them leave. She was already focused on the next task. The front wall. She needed a frame. She felled a dozen young, straight lodgepole pines, a brutal labor that left her body trembling with exhaustion. She notched them not with the perfect, showy precision of a Croft cabin, but with a simple, functional strength. She erected a low A-frame that enclosed the front of the alcove, leaving a small opening for a door and a window. For the infill, the insulation, she turned again to her grandmother's wisdom. She wove a dense lattice of willow branches between the timbers, creating a sturdy web. Then, she began to apply the daub. It was a mixture of clay, dried grasses, and moss. She slapped it on by the handful, forcing it into the lattice, building up the layers inside and out. It was messy, primal work. She was not so much building a wall as she was sculpting one, molding her shelter from the very earth of the valley. Inside, she built her stove. It was not a great iron beast like the ones in town. It was a small, incredibly efficient masonry heater, built of flat stones and sealed with clay. It was designed to burn small amounts of wood very hot, transferring the heat not to the air, but to the thermal mass of the stones and the great rock wall behind it. The stovepipe, a final piece of fired clay, fit snugly into the bottom of her vertical flue. For her floor, she laid a bed of smooth, flat river stones. On top of that, a thick layer of dry moss and pine boughs, which she would replenish throughout the winter. It was fragrant and soft, a carpet provided by the forest. She carved shelves directly into the softer sandstone at the back of the alcove and built a sleeping platform out of leftover pine, raising it off the floor. Her door was a simple frame covered in a stretched deer hide she had traded for with old Jedediah, the only person who didn't treat her with pity or scorn. He had simply grunted, examined her handiwork with a trapper's critical eye, and said, "Warmer than some I've seen." For a window, she stretched a cleaned and scraped piece of sheep intestine over a small opening, a trick from Astrid's journal. It was translucent, turning the gray autumn light into a milky, ethereal glow. By the time the first snows began to fall, her home was complete. It was not a cabin. It was a liminal space, neither indoors nor out, part cave, part hut, part living creature. It was dark and smelled of earth, clay, and pine. But it was hers, and it was ready. The first month of winter was a test. The temperature dropped, and the waterfall began to transform. The spray hitting the outer rocks froze into delicate, crystalline traceries. The sound of the water changed, becoming deeper, more muffled, as ice began to choke its flow. Inside, Alara kept her small stove fed with dry branches. The heat it produced was gentle, a constant, radiant warmth that soaked into the stone wall behind it. The great mass of the mountain became her hearth. The flue worked exactly as her grandmother had described, pulling the smoke and the moisture up and out, keeping the air inside crisp and dry. The mockery from the town did not cease, but it grew more distant. She was a ghost they had already mourned. They were too busy with their own looming crisis. The cold was worse than anyone had predicted. The green wood they had stockpiled hissed and smoldered, producing more smoke than heat. The croft-built cabins, for all their sturdy grandeur, were sieves. The cold seeped through the chinking. It radiated from the windows. It poured down the massive, inefficient chimneys. The iron stoves, their pride and joy, became insatiable monsters. Families were burning through a week's worth of wood in 3 days. The sound of axes echoed through the valley from dawn till dusk, a frantic, percussive heartbeat of fear. They were fighting a war of attrition against the cold, and they were losing. Then, in the second week of January, the whispering death stopped whispering. It began to scream. The sky turned a bruised, slate gray, and the wind began to blow not from one direction, but from all of them at once. The locals called it a white hurricane. It was a blizzard of historic, terrifying proportions. Snow did not fall. It flew, horizontally, a blinding, scouring torrent of ice crystals. The temperature plummeted to depths that froze the mercury in their thermometers. It was a cold that was not just a lack of heat, but a physical presence, a force that sought out life and extinguished it. In Croft's Crossing, the world shrank to the interior of their log cabins, and those interiors were failing. The wind, a physical blow, forced its way through every tiny crack, every unsealed joint. It was a relentless, searching cold. The massive fires in the iron stoves created a powerful convection, sucking the warm air up the chimney and pulling freezing drafts across the floor. Water barrels froze solid just 10 feet from the fire. Frost climbed the interior walls, a crystalline tracery of failure. They burned furniture, they burned books, they burned their own fence posts. The woodpiles vanished. The hollow promises of their sturdy cabins were exposed. The structures were nothing but beautifully crafted wooden tents, magnificent shells that offered the illusion of shelter, but no true sanctuary. In his own grand cabin, the largest in the valley, Silas Croft was facing his own personal reckoning. His youngest daughter, Sarah, was sick. A fever had taken hold in her lungs, and her breaths were shallow, rattling things. The doctor had said she needed warmth and dry air, but the air in their home was a vicious cycle of scorching heat near the stove and Arctic cold everywhere else. His wife Mary sat by the girl's bedside, wrapped in every blanket they owned, her face a mask of terror. Their wood was almost gone, a few dozen green logs hissing resentfully in the firebox. Silas had built this house with his own hands. He had personally notched every log. He had boasted of its strength, its permanence. Now, it was killing his daughter. The pride he had felt in his creation had curdled into a bitter, helpless rage. On the third day of the blizzard, with the wind shrieking like a banshee and the last of his seasoned wood turned to ash, a terrible, desperate thought took root in his mind. The widow. The madwoman behind the waterfall. He did not think of her as a source of help. He thought of her with a grim, morbid certainty. She must be dead. Frozen solid weeks ago, sealed in her icy tomb, just as he had predicted. The thought brought him no satisfaction, only a profound sense of guilt. His condemnation had been her death sentence. He had to go. He had to see. Perhaps he could bring her body back. It was a penance. A fool's errand in the middle of a hurricane of ice, but it was something to do. An action to take in the face of his own catastrophic impotence. "I'm going out," he told his wife. "Silas, no! You'll die!" she cried. "I'm going to the waterfall," he said, "to check on the widow." Mary looked at him as if he had lost his mind. "She's long dead, husband. There's nothing to check on." "I have to," he said. He wrapped himself in layers of wool and oilskin, pulled a heavy fur hat down over his ears, and stepped out into the maelstrom. The world outside was an abstract chaos of white and gray. The wind tore the breath from his lungs and filled his eyes with tears that froze instantly to his eyelashes. He could not see more than 5 feet in front of him. He navigated by memory, by the feel of the land beneath his feet. The journey, which would normally take 20 minutes, became an epic struggle for survival. The cold was a living thing, clawing at his clothes, seeking his warmth. More than once, he stumbled and fell, the snow devouring him. The temptation to simply lie there and let the white silence take him, almost overwhelming. But the image of his daughter's pale face, the sound of her ragged breathing, pushed him onward. He found the creek and followed its frozen, snow-choked path. After what felt like an eternity, he saw it. A shape looming out of the white chaos. The weeping maid. It was unrecognizable. The waterfall was gone, replaced by a colossal, multi-tiered pillar of ice. It was a frozen cathedral, sculpted by the wind and the cold into fantastical shapes. It was beautiful and terrible. He had been right. It had frozen solid. It was a tomb. He staggered towards the base of the icefall, his heart heavy with a grim sense of vindication and despair. He expected to find the entrance to her hovel completely sealed by a wall of blue ice. But as he got closer, he saw something that made him stop. Something impossible. From a small fissure high up on the rock face, far above the ice, a thin, almost invisible plume of smoke was rising. It was not the thick, choking smoke of a smoldering fire, but a clean, pale gray wisp that was instantly torn apart by the wind. It was steady, consistent. Smoke. He scrambled over a drift of snow, his mind reeling, and then he smelled it. Faintly at first, then stronger as he neared the curtain of ice. An aroma that had no place in this dead, frozen world. The scent of wood smoke, yes, but something else. Something warm and rich and alive. It was the smell of baking bread. He reached the wall of ice. It was not a solid barrier. The constant, subtle warmth from within had kept the space directly in front of her dwelling from freezing completely. A thick curtain of icicles hung down, but behind them was a space, a passage. With numb, clumsy hands, he pushed through the icicles. They broke with a sound like shattering glass. He stepped through, out of the screaming wind, and into an astonishing stillness. He was in a narrow tunnel of ice. Ahead of him, glowing with a soft, warm light, was the hide-covered door of Alara's home. The light was coming from her translucent window. He stumbled forward and pushed open the door, which swung inward on its simple leather hinges. The contrast was so profound it was a physical shock. The wind was gone. The soul-stealing cold was gone. He was standing in a space filled with a gentle, pervasive warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an iron stove, but a soft, radiant heat that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The air was dry and smelled of pine, earth, and the overwhelming, miraculous scent of fresh bread. Alara was there. She was sitting on a low stool by her small clay stove, a wooden peel in her hand. She had just pulled a small, perfectly browned loaf from the oven cavity built into the stove's side. She was not emaciated. She was not frostbitten. Her cheeks were flushed with warmth. She was calm. She was alive. She was thriving. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. There was no surprise, no fear, no triumph, only a quiet, waiting stillness. Silas Croft stared, his mind unable to process the scene. He looked at the smooth, clay-plastered walls, the shelves carved into the rock holding jars of dried berries and herbs. He looked at the ingenious stove, glowing with a soft, cherry-red heat from its vents. He looked at the dry, moss-covered floor. He looked at the woman he had condemned to death, who was now looking at him as if he were a ghost who had wandered in from the storm. He took a staggering step forward, and then another. The warmth enveloped him, seeping into his frozen bones, and the sheer impossibility of it all broke him. His legs gave way. He fell to his knees on the soft, fragrant floor. "How?" he whispered, the word a ragged croak. It was not a demand, it was a plea, a question directed not just at her, but at the universe, at the fundamental laws of physics he thought he understood so completely. Alara did not answer with words. She rose, took a clay bowl from a shelf, cut a thick slice from the warm loaf of bread, and ladled a steaming broth from the pot simmering on her stove. She knelt and handed it to him. He took it, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the bowl. He ate the bread like a starving animal. He drank the broth, and the warmth spread through his chest, a wave of life pushing back the tide of death. When he had finished, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it was a physical pain. My daughter," he stammered. "She's sick. The cold. Our house is a tomb of ice." Ilara listened. She simply nodded. It was all the answer he needed. The unspoken offer of sanctuary. He struggled back to his feet. "I will bring them," he said. The journey back was a blur. Fueled by the warmth of the broth and a desperate, burgeoning hope, he fought his way back to his cabin. He burst through the door, a wild man caked in snow and ice. He gathered his wife and daughter, wrapped the child in their last dry blankets, and led them back out into the storm. Mary followed him, her face a mask of terrified confusion, but the certainty in his eyes was absolute. He led them to the waterfall, through the curtain of ice, and into the impossible warmth of Ilara's home. When Mary saw the space, when she felt the gentle, life-giving heat, she began to weep, silent tears of relief and disbelief freezing on her cheeks. Ilara took the sick child from her arms, settled her onto her own raised bed, and covered her with a warm fur pelt. They were the first. But they were not the last. Silas went out again, a missionary of this newfound salvation. He went to his brother's house, then to the Albrights. He brought them, family by family, through the blizzard to the Cascade Folly. The small, earthen home became an ark. 18 people found shelter in that small space, huddled together in the gentle, radiant warmth. They were the very people who had mocked her, who had pitied her, who had cast her out. Now they were her supplicants, their lives held in the palm of her capable hands. In the quiet warmth of the cave, surrounded by the sleeping forms of his neighbors and the sound of his daughter's breathing, which was already becoming less ragged, Silas Croft sat on the floor and watched Ilara. She moved with a quiet efficiency, adding a single small log to the stove, checking on the sick child, offering a cup of water to an elder. There was no arrogance in her, no "I told you so." There was only a deep, abiding competence. He looked at the curve of the flue against the rock wall. He looked at the thickness of the daub and wattle front. He finally understood. He had been building against the winter. She had been building with it. He had relied on a single brute force solution, a big fire. She had created a system, an ecosystem, where the mountain, the water, the ice, and the earth all worked in concert. He had built his houses to consume fuel. She had built her home to conserve life. He finally turned to her in the dim light. "I built their houses," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You built them a home. I was wrong. I was a fool." The admission, spoken aloud, was both a surrender and a liberation. It was the death of his pride and the birth of his humility. When the great blizzard finally broke and a weak, watery sun appeared in the sky, the valley was a changed place. It was a landscape of buried houses and profound silence. But from behind the frozen waterfall, life emerged. The first order of business in the New World was justice. Silas Croft, in front of the entire settlement, publicly tore up Ilara's eviction notice and the ledger page that detailed her debt. He offered her the deed to her old cabin and to the 10 acres surrounding it. She accepted the deed, but politely refused the cabin. Her home was here. Her status was transformed overnight. She was no longer the mad widow, the object of pity. She was the savior, the sage, They no longer called her home Croft's Cascade Folly, they called it the Haven. Pause here. Consider the nature of that transformation. It was not achieved through argument or persuasion or pleading. It was achieved through the undeniable, demonstrated reality of a warm room and a loaf of bread in the heart of a killing storm. True authority is not claimed, it is revealed. It is not found in the volume of a voice, but in the soundness of a structure. The following spring, a delegation came to her, led by a humbled Silas Croft. They did not come to offer charity. They came to ask for knowledge. "Teach us," Croft said simply. "Teach us how to build like this." And so she did. That summer was not spent in the frantic, inefficient stockpiling of wood. It was a season of education. Ilara, with Silas as her most eager apprentice, taught them the principles her grandmother had written down. She taught them about thermal mass, about siting a home to take advantage of the sun and shelter from the wind. She taught them how to mix clay and build the small, hyper-efficient masonry stoves. They did not abandon their log cabins, but they transformed them. They built stone hearths that held the heat. They dug cellars that acted as thermal batteries. They learned to build with the landscape, not just upon it. The lessons of the Haven were integrated into the architectural DNA of the entire valley. Ilara's home behind the waterfall became a sacred place, a schoolhouse of survival. She never married again, but she was never alone. She became the valley's wise woman, its engineer, its memory. The knowledge that had been dismissed as old-world foolishness became the new, life-saving conventional wisdom. Generations later, the story was still told. The story of the Whispering Death, and how it almost scoured the valley clean. And the story of the young widow who listened to the wisdom of her grandmother and dug her salvation out of the cold earth. The children of the valley would visit the Haven, touching the smooth clay walls, looking up at the flue that had been the settlement's salvation, and marveling at the simple, profound physics of it all. The legacy of Ilara was not just in the warmer, safer houses. It was in the humility she had taught them. The understanding that sometimes the most powerful innovations are not gleaming new machines, but forgotten, time-tested truths. It was the knowledge that true strength is not always found in the grand, imposing structure, but often in the small, resilient shelter that knows how to bend to the wind, how to draw warmth from the stone, and how to survive, not by shouting at the storm, but by listening to its secrets. The lesson of the Haven is a simple one. The answers we need are often not in front of us, but beneath us. They are buried in the earth, in the past, in the quiet wisdom of those who came before us, who survived their own winters and left behind their own blueprints. The question is, what forgotten wisdom lies dormant in your own life, dismissed as folly, waiting for a winter cold enough to prove its worth? What is growing, quietly, behind the waterfall you have been taught to fear?